Hi, I'm Ricky Robertson. I'm an educator and author who works with schools in developing social, emotional, and behavioral supports for students impacted by adverse childhood experiences and trauma. Today I'm going to speak to you a bit about ACEs, trauma, and toxic stress, helping us to understand how they impact young people's health now and also long-term over the course of their life. In today's session, I'm going to be discussing some tough topics, so I want to begin by inviting you to care for your own well-being as needed. I'm going to be discussing things related to child abuse and neglect, and it can stir up some uncomfortable feelings, sensations, and even memories for some of us. I'm going to begin by talking about some foundational research, a groundbreaking study conducted in the mid-90s by Robert Anda and Vincent Felitti in partnership with Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. In this study, now commonly referred to as the ACE study, researchers surveyed approximately 17,500 people who lived in Southern California. And they asked these individuals if they had ever experienced any of these 10 types of childhood adversity: physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, death of a parent, incarceration of a parent, someone in the home suffering from a mental illness, or abandonment due to separation or divorce. And they then looked at the responses that participants gave. They looked at the number of adverse childhood experiences that had occurred in their life between birth and age 18, and they looked at their health records to see if there was any relationship. And they found three striking findings. The first was that adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, were far more common than they had anticipated. So roughly 20% of participants in the ACE study reported experiencing sexual abuse while they were growing up. That's about 1 out of every 5 adults. 30% of participants reported experiencing physical abuse. 70% said that they had had at least one adverse childhood experience, and nearly half of participants had experienced multiple forms of trauma while they were growing up. Something to keep in mind is that that first ACE study, of those 17,500 participants roughly, 75% of them were white, and the majority of participants were able to participate in that study because they had employer health care coverage, so also an overwhelmingly middle-class population of folks. Subsequent studies have shown that adverse childhood experiences and trauma are prevalent across humanity. They are prevalent across race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, geographic regions, whether you live in a rural, urban, or suburban community. Something to keep in mind, though, is that while trauma is prevalent across humanity, the way that trauma is responded to and the access people have to care can be heavily impacted by forms of systemic inequities and oppression. Another key finding of the ACE study was that ACEs tend to cluster. Now, this is kind of common sense. So if you have, for example, a parent who's an alcoholic, you're significantly more likely to experience other forms of abuse or neglect. What is perhaps the most groundbreaking finding of this study was that ACEs have a dose relationship with long-term health impairments. And so this means that for every adverse childhood experience that occurred between birth and age 18, it significantly increased the likelihood that someone would develop a physical, mental, or behavioral health impairment later in life. So for example, someone with 4 ACEs was shown to be twice as likely to develop cancer as someone with none. 7 times more likely to struggle with substance abuse and dependence, and as much as 12 times more likely to struggle with severe depression and suicidality. In fact, someone with 6 ACEs was found to have a life expectancy 20 years shorter than someone with none. Adverse childhood experiences and trauma have been shown to have that dose relationship with a variety of physical, mental, and behavioral health impairments, including cardiovascular disease, emphysema, type 1 diabetes, various other autoimmune diseases, as well as anxiety, depression, suicidality, many of the public health crises that plague a majority of Americans. The first ACE study just looked at 10 types of childhood adversity. Now, if you think about the students within your school community, there are many forms of trauma and adversity that they encounter that initial study didn't explore, but subsequent research has looked at. Things like poverty, homelessness, systemic racism, community violence, as well as natural disasters. We can recognize that it's pretty much impossible to create a complete list of all of the different types of trauma, but there are different realms within which trauma occurs. Trauma and adverse childhood experiences can occur within the household, things like domestic violence, abuse, neglect. They can also occur within the community. Poverty, homelessness, lack of jobs that pay a living wage, lack of affordable housing, things that contribute to significant instability and struggle within a community. Also different forms of community violence. There can be forms of trauma that are generational as well as historical. So for example, in the 1960s, child psychiatrists were trying to figure out why the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were as much as 300% more likely to be institutionalized for severe psychiatric issues and challenges. These were the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors living in Canada, so they weren't living in a place where the Holocaust had occurred. Many of them had not even met their grandparents who were survivors, and yet they were more likely to struggle with severe mental health issues. Now that was in the 1960s. Decades later, we have research on the epigenetic effects of trauma, showing that trauma can impact the way our genes are read and expressed. When a mass trauma occurs to a population of people, that may be a Holocaust, a genocide, a war, a natural disaster, slavery, colonization, it can impact the health of that generation, and it can impact the health of future generations. Research has shown that some descendants of trauma survivors can have genetic predispositions to things like high blood pressure, diabetes, anxiety, depression, and even PTSD-related symptoms. Something that I want us to keep in mind is that if we even think about our own families, and I can even think about my own family line and the way that different forms of trauma, as well as some coping behaviors that weren't necessarily very healthy, got passed down from generation to generation. But what we have to remember is that with generational trauma also comes generational resilience. And so when we are from families or from communities or work within communities impacted by historical and generational trauma, we have to honor and look for the evidence of the incredible strength of our loved ones and of our neighbors and of our community members. And as educators, when we teach in ways that are affirming of students' cultures, identities, and languages, we're affirming the ways of knowing and speaking and valuing that have sustained their families for generations. When we teach in ways that are culturally responsive and affirming, we're affirming the generational resilience of our students. Now, trauma can not only be generational and historical, it can also be cumulative. Cumulative trauma refers to repeated experiences of discrimination, racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-immigrant discrimination, for example, and the repeated kind of million tiny cuts, if you will, that can impact an individual's mental and physical health. One example of cumulative trauma is if we look at the impact of family rejecting behaviors among LGBTQ+ youth. That when queer and trans youth experience family rejection at home, whether it's trying to kind of pray away the gay, or it might even be kicking a child out of the house because of their sexual orientation under a gender identity, they're as much as 8 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to an LGBTQ+ youth who has an accepting and affirming family. Now the good news is that an affirming teacher or educator who supports that student, who accepts them for who they are, can reduce the risk of suicidality for LGBTQ+ youth by as much as 40 to 65%, according to some studies. That's an incredible, life-saving contribution you may be doing day to day in your job. And that's just one example of both a form of cumulative trauma and what we'll talk about in just a moment, the protective factor of a positive, supportive relationship. And lastly, there can be forms of trauma that occur within the environment. Wildfires, hurricanes, natural disasters, etc. One of the most important things that I encourage you to take away from today's session is that our past is not our destiny. While trauma is prevalent across humanity, resilience is our birthright. Each and every one of us has an innate capacity for healthy resilience. And thankfully, we have an incredible amount of research about the power of positive childhood experiences and protective factors. Protective factors help to mitigate or lessen or reduce the harmful effects of trauma and support young people's well-being. Protective factors include things such as positive relationships, time in nature, mindfulness practices, communication and stress management skills, things that give young people a sense of hope, purpose, possibility, and joy. Play, sports, music, artistic expression, these are all things that help to support a young person's mental, physical, and emotional well-being. Critical protective factors, many of which we provide every single day in schools across our country. And so a trauma-informed approach is ultimately a strength-based approach, a testament to the incredible power of the human spirit and the critical role that schools can play in helping to create ecosystems of care, providing students with access to many protective factors, whether it's opportunities for success, for learning, for having healthy and supportive relationships, as well as being a bridge for children and families to access other forms of support and care and enrichment within our communities. This is ultimately healing-centered work.
The Trauma-Informed Teaching Series is made possible by a partnership between the National Education Association and WETA. For more information, please visit adlit.org/trauma.